But so the town turns automatic to warple. Send the sign or in I crane.
In 1962, someone in Centralia, Pennsylvania decided to burn trash in an old strip mine pit. The fire spread underground into the anthracite seam. By 1983, 21 years later, the U.S. Department of Interior concluded the mine fire was terminal. They ordered 100 people out of their homes and spent $42 million to relocate them. As of 2020, 4 people remain in what used to be a town. The fire is still burning. Estimates say it will burn for another 250 years, maybe longer, which means the people who caused it have been dead for decades, and the people who live with the consequences haven't been born yet. But here's the part that matters. Nobody was trying to burn the town down. The fire wasn't arson, it wasn't malice. It was the result of trying to solve a smaller problem, trash buildup, using the cheapest method available, one controlled burn. One decision made by local government that seemed reasonable at the time. And it cascaded into something that consumed a community and a landscape for centuries. So the real question isn't how a fire got out of control. Is this: why does a society allow the people in its middle, the people trying to manage towns, disposal problems, resources they don't have, to absorb the costs of decisions they didn't fully understand? And once those costs become visible, why does everyone blame the people on the ground instead of the systems that put them there? We have 3 sources here, and they were produced in different moments by different institutions asking different questions. The first is Robert Sternberg, a psychologist at Oklahoma State University, publishing in February 2012 in the International Journal of Educational Psychology. His paper is called Teaching for Ethical Reasoning, and he uses Centralia as the opening case study, the cautionary tale. He's asking, how do we teach people to think ethically? How do institutions fail to respond to crises that are obviously unfolding in front of them? The second source is much more recent. Chris Kowalczyk, an undergraduate at Seton Hall University, published How Anthracite Smothered Centralia, Pennsylvania in October 2024. He's doing historical excavation, asking not just what happened to Centralia, but what the mining industry's collapse in the region tells us about how industrial economies extract value and then abandon the people left behind. The third is Glenn Strachur and Tammy Taylor, writing in 2004 for the International Journal of Coal Geology. They're making a global argument. Coal fires are burning uncontrolled across China, India, and the United States, and nobody's talking about it. These are scientific voices, raising an alarm. Here's what matters. Sternberg wrote about Centralia in 2012 because the town had been on fire for 50 years at that point. Kowalczyk wrote about it in 2024, 62 years after the fire started, because the fire is still burning and the story is being forgotten. And Strachur and Taylor wrote their global survey in 2004, because by then, governments and industries worldwide had essentially decided that controlling coal fires was too expensive, so they just manage around them instead. Let's look at what they actually put in writing. The Bureau of Mines report from 1980, which both Sternberg and Kowalczyk cite, estimated that extinguishing the Centralia fire completely would cost around $84 million. That was $1,980. Instead, the government spent $42 million to relocate people. The math balances, but the logic doesn't. They chose to erase a town, rather than solve the problem underneath it. Why are these sources being produced now? Because Centralia is no longer visible. In 1962, it was a town. By 1987, it was a ghost. By 2020, 4 people were left, and because Centralia is invisible, the larger pattern, which Strachur and Taylor document, also becomes invisible. There are 140 underground coal mine fires and 58 burning refuse piles currently active in Pennsylvania alone. In China, coal fires consume 200 million tons of coal per year. That's equivalent to the emissions from every vehicle in the United States. And because these fires aren't happening in one town, in one media moment, they don't generate the same attention. The sources exist because they're trying to prevent Centralia from being the last thing anyone learns about this problem. They're trying to reverse the erasure while there's still institutional memory to build on. Let's start with what happened. The Bureau of Mines report from 1980 is the official government autopsy. It documents the fire's origin with clinical precision. Here's what they found. In 1962, someone burned trash in the pit of an abandoned strip mine. An exposed vein of coal caught fire. The fire was doused with water, and town officials thought the fire was extinguished. But it wasn't, and the fire erupted again, unexpectedly, in the same pit just a few days later. So they tried again. More water was applied, and town officials thought that was the end of it. But again, it wasn't. The fire spread underground. That's not a disaster, that's a pattern. Water didn't work the first time. Water didn't work the second time. And yet, the institutional response was to keep applying water as if repetition might change the outcome. By July 1962, just 2 months in, it was already clear. Dense fumes were emitting from the ground, and the fire had already moved 200 feet, a considerable distance for an anthracite fire in such a short amount of time. 200 feet in 8 weeks. They knew it was accelerating, and they still didn't know what they were dealing with. The thing about coal fires is that they don't burn like surface fires. Stracher and Taylor explain the mechanics. Carbon monoxide, hydrogen, and the hydrocarbons ethylene, propylene, and acetylene are monitored as coal fire detector gases because they are released sequentially as temperature increases during heating. Consecutive temperatures at which release begins in medium volatile bituminous coal, for example, are about 110 CO, 170H2, 240C2H4, and 300 degrees Celsius, C3H6. Combustion occurs between about 110 to 170 degrees Celsius, and flames appear at about 200 degrees Celsius. So the fire doesn't need to reach the surface. It doesn't need visible flame. It's producing toxic gases at temperatures that are already dangerous, before anyone can even see it burning. And in Pennsylvania's anthracite fields, the geography makes it worse. Stracher notes, the anthracite fields in the state are not entirely flat, and their pitch is a crucial factor in the spread of underground fire, as these angles allow for the circulation of air and flames. The landscape itself feeds the fire. Oxygen circulates through the seams. Heat gets trapped. The coal turns to ash, creating space for air to flow, which creates more space for the fire to spread. By 1966, Pennsylvania had spent about $100,000 trying to extinguish the fire. Nothing worked. Congress passed the Appalachian Regional Development Act that year, and in 1965, which is, I know, technically before 1966, but this is how bureaucracy moves, they approved a $2.5 million federal intervention. The plan was ambitious. They drilled 635 boreholes. They pumped 556 tons of fly ash underground. They built trenches designed to seal off the fire from spreading. This project ran from 1966 to 1973. 7 years. $2.7 million spent. And here's what the Bureau of Mines concluded. Soon after it was completed, elevated temperatures and carbon monoxide from the mine fire were discovered in boreholes past the exclusion trench. The trench failed. The fire had already spread past it. All that engineering, all that money, all that effort, and the fire kept moving. So what did the government do? They kept trying different methods. Inundation, flushing, surface sealing. By 1980, when the Bureau of Mines issued their final assessment, they had to acknowledge something bleak. In some cases, these fires have outlasted repeated control efforts for more than a decade, or recurred after they were thought to be extinguished. They didn't say, "We don't know how to stop this." They said, "Fires outlast our efforts." The fire had become the constant. The institution was the temporary failure. Meanwhile, the people living above the fire were kept in the dark about its severity. Sternberg describes a phenomenon he calls ethical drift. Listen to this. Ethical drift is the gradual ebbing of standards that can occur in an individual, a group, or an organization as a result of the interaction of environmental pressures with those subjected to these pressures. It often occurs insidiously, and even without the conscious awareness of those being subjected to it. He then offers an example that's almost painfully relevant. Students, for example, may begin by lifting a few words from materials gathered from the internet and gradually progress to sentences, paragraph, and then major parts of, or even whole papers. The process is much more insidious than when a student merely decides to buy a paper from a paper writing mill. The students may not be aware the process even has taken place. Now apply that to Centralia. The town wasn't evacuated because of one catastrophic event. It was evacuated because of something much slower. Kowalczyk documents this. In May of 1969, state mine inspectors detected unsafe levels of carbon monoxide in 3 homes, which forced these families to vacate. In 1976, a borehole was found emitting 20 times the fatal amount of carbon monoxide, causing alarm. In 1979, ground temperatures at a gas station became hot enough to jeopardize underground gasoline storage tanks. In 1980, the government purchased 7 properties in the town legally. 7 years of incidents, 7 years of creeping danger, no evacuation order, no federal emergency declaration, just incremental purchases, incremental awareness, incremental acceptance that something was wrong. But here's where it gets interesting. The people of Centralia knew something was wrong before the government officially admitted it. Kowalczyk includes testimony from residents. One person, Joseph Smolak, said this: "Everyone has that little voice inside that tells them what's right and wrong, and if I leave, I'll be going against what my voice tells me is right, my heritage, my past, and my soul." He didn't want to leave. The town was his home, but there was also resistance. An organization called Residents to Save the Borough of Centralia issued a statement. 6 years of meetings, studies, surveys, engineering evaluations, borehole analyses, relocation projects, referendums, petitions, mind-manipulating tactics, exploitation by every conceivable source, and still, the root of the problem remains ignored. Since 1978, nothing has been done to prevent the effects of the mine fire from threatening our communities. This is 1983 or so. They're not asking to leave, they're demanding that the government fix the fire. And the government's answer was, "We can't fix it. We'll relocate you instead." Helen Warmer said, "They're going to go through, seeing their neighbors' homes, memories, as though the house was once alive and it is slowly being killed." So when the relocation happened, it wasn't because people chose to leave. It was because the institution decided that erasing the town was cheaper than saving it. And finally, here's what the global coal fire research tells us. Streeter and Taylor document 140 underground coal fires and 58 burning refuse piles in Pennsylvania. 40 years after Centralia started burning, there are 139 other fires still active in the same state. They note, according to the latest estimate of the U.S. Department of the Interior, more than $651 million is needed to control these fires in the U.S. alone. $651 million, that's present-day dollars. And yet the response has been, not to find that money, but to accept the fires as permanent features of the landscape. In China, Stracher writes, the fires consume up to 200 million tons of coal per year and account for as much as 2 to 3% of the annual world emission of atmospheric CO2 from burning fossil fuels. This is equivalent to the CO2 emitted per annum from all vehicles in the United States. One country's coal fires are producing as much atmospheric pollution as every car in America. That's not a side effect of coal mining. That's a parallel energy crisis, unquantified and unaddressed. The math balances, but the logic doesn't. We know what it costs to fix these fires, we choose not to pay it. So the fires keep burning. And the pattern Centralia established, slow recognition, delayed action, eventual abandonment, becomes the permanent policy. Here's what the sources are actually arguing, beneath the surface. It's not that Centralia is a tragedy. Tragedies are accidents. This is something else. The thesis is this: institutions don't fail to respond to crises they understand. They respond by redefining the crisis as inevitable, normalizing it, and then managing around it. And they do this not out of malice, but out of rational calculation. A fire that costs $84 million to extinguish is redefined as a problem that requires relocation at $42 million. Both are catastrophic, but one is cheaper, so that becomes the policy. The system doesn't break. The system works exactly as it was designed to work, which is to preserve itself, not the people inside it. Sternberg's framework of ethical drift isn't describing a moral failure. It's describing how organizations absorb pressure by gradually shifting their baseline of what's acceptable. What was unthinkable in 1962, evacuating an entire town, became inevitable by 1983 because the incremental steps made it seem like the only option left. The government wasn't being stubborn or stupid. They were being efficient. They were adjusting. The strongest objection to this thesis is straightforward. You're being unfair. The government did try to fix Centralia. They spent millions of dollars on 7-year projects. They drilled boreholes. They pumped fly ash. They brought in expertise. They didn't give up immediately. They exhausted options. And when those options failed, relocation was genuinely the best option left. You're retroactively condemning people for not having technology or knowledge they didn't possess. That's a fair critique. And it's mostly true. The people making decisions in 1962 and 1966 and 1973 couldn't have known that the fire would take 250 years to burn out. They couldn't have predicted the exact trajectory of spread. They did try conventional methods, and those methods failed in ways that were genuinely difficult to anticipate. So on that level, the government wasn't negligent. They were unlucky. But here's where the thesis holds. The actual failure wasn't in 1962 or 1966 or 1973. The failure was in 1962, when someone decided to burn trash in a pit next to a coal seam, and nobody asked whether that was safe. The failure was in the lack of planning that put a dump site in a location that could transmit fire to underground coal. The failure was in the years between 1962 and 1980, when the government kept residents in partial information, monitoring carbon monoxide, evacuating individual homes, but not saying, "This town is uninhabitable. You need to leave." The failure was in the decision to keep trying to extinguish a fire that the science already told them would be nearly impossible to kill. Stracher and Taylor note that coal fires in Pennsylvania have been documented since 1772. 1772. That's 190 years of recorded coal fires before Centralia even started. The knowledge existed. The precedent existed. What didn't exist was the will to prevent coal fires in the first place, because prevention would require regulation, and regulation would cost money up front. So instead, you build dumps next to coal seams. You hope nothing catches fire. And when it inevitably does, you manage it as a cleanup problem rather than a prevention problem. Systems don't panic. They adjust. And adjustment by definition means accepting losses that could have been prevented. And here's the piece that makes this thesis matter beyond Centralia. Stracher documents 140 other fires in Pennsylvania. He documents massive fires in China and India. Kowalczyk shows that the entire anthracite industry was collapsing by the 1930s, and nobody was preparing workers or communities for that collapse. They were extracting coal right up until it became economically impossible, and then leaving. The pattern isn't unique. The pattern is systematic. Industries find locations with resources. They extract those resources as efficiently as possible. They externalize the costs, the environmental damage, the community disruption, the long-term infrastructure problems, onto the people living in those places. And when the resource is exhausted or becomes uneconomical, they leave. The towns that depended on that resource have to absorb the full cost of the damage. That's not a bug in how capitalism works. That's the design. Centralia is the most visible example because it's a single town that burned in real time. But Kowalczyk's broader argument is that the whole anthracite region was slowly burned out, economically, socially, environmentally, over a century. The fire is just a literalization of that process. So when we ask, why didn't the government fix Centralia? We're asking the wrong question. The right question is, why would an industry or government ever fix something they've already extracted all the value from? So the final piece. What does this tell us about how to read institutional failures? The sources, Sternberg on ethical drift, Kowalczyk on regional history, Stracher on global coal fires, are all pointing at the same mechanism. Institutions don't respond to crises they don't have resources to solve in ways that threaten their own operation. They respond by accepting the crisis as permanent and managing around it. They relocate people instead of fixing fires. They close mines instead of protecting workers. They allow fires to burn in China and India because the cost of extinguishing them globally is larger than any government's budget. And critically, they do this while appearing to try. Relocation looks like a solution. Closure looks like a decision. Monitoring looks like action. But none of it addresses the root problem, because addressing the root problem, preventing the fire in the first place, regulating where dumps can be placed, enforcing fire prevention codes before the industry collapses, would require power over the forces that created the situation. And that power doesn't exist, because the institutions that would need to exercise it are the same institutions that benefited from the extraction. The math balances, but the logic doesn't. So the fire keeps burning, the pattern keeps repeating, and we keep learning about it in academic papers written by scholars trying to make the pattern visible before it becomes completely normal. Here's what you should take from this. Centralia is not an aberration, it's a proof of concept. It proves that when an institution faces a choice between spending money to prevent damage or spending money to manage damage after it occurs, it will choose management. It will choose it consistently, rationally, and with full knowledge of the consequences. Not because the people making the decision are cruel or negligent, but because the system itself has no capacity to choose differently. The fire started because someone burned trash without checking what was underneath. 70 years later, nobody had required that check. The fire spread because coal seams run under the town. 70 years later, nobody had mapped those seams before putting a dump on top of them. The fire was impossible to extinguish because the geology of Pennsylvania naturally feeds underground flames. 70 years of geological science later, nobody had used that knowledge to prevent coal fires in the first place. The verdict is this: we are not bad at preventing catastrophes. We are structurally incapable of it. We are good at managing them after they happen. And we have optimized ourselves into a position where managing catastrophes is cheaper than preventing them, which means we will keep choosing to let them happen. In 1962, someone burned trash in a pit. In 2024, coal fires are still burning in Pennsylvania, China, and India. Nothing has changed because the incentive structure that produced the first fire is still producing the others. The fire will keep burning. That's not a prediction. That's a feature. But here's what the sources don't answer, and it's the question that matters more than anything they do answer. Sternberg writes about teaching ethical reasoning. He believes that if we teach people to recognize crises, define them as ethical problems, take personal responsibility for solving them, and prepare to face pressure not to act, if we teach all of that systematically, then maybe ethical behavior becomes possible. Maybe people won't experience ethical drift. Maybe they'll intervene. But the sources also show that by the time Centralia residents recognized the fire as an ethical problem that required intervention, the institutional machinery had already moved past the point where intervention was possible. The fire had spread too far. The money had run out. The people in power had decided it was uncontrollable. So the open question is this: is the failure to prevent catastrophe a failure of individual ethics or a failure of institutional structure? Can teaching people to think ethically actually change the output of a system that is optimized to ignore ethics? Or are we training people to be frustrated, to feel morally responsible for problems that are structurally outside their capacity to solve? Sternberg doesn't ask that question. He assumes education in ethical reasoning will matter. But the Centralia case suggests it won't. The educated people, the engineers, the Bureau of Mines officials, the government administrators, understood the problem perfectly. They acted rationally given the constraints. The problem wasn't understanding or will, the problem was the constraints themselves. So what are we actually teaching when we teach ethical reasoning in a system that structurally prevents ethical outcomes? So the final thing, you've now read about a fire that started in 1962 and is still burning. You've seen that it consumed a town, displaced over 1,000 people, and cost more than $40 million to manage. You've learned that there are 140 other fires doing the same thing in Pennsylvania and hundreds more globally, consuming a resource that's becoming obsolete anyway. You understand that this wasn't negligence or stupidity, it was rational institutional behavior. And you know that the same pattern is happening right now in places you don't see, in ways you can't quite name, because the machinery is very good at obscuring itself. So what do you do with that information? That's not rhetorical. I don't know the answer. The sources don't contain it. Because the question requires imagining a different structure of incentives, different institutions, different power relationships. It requires imagining solutions that are outside the frame of the problem. And systems don't panic, they adjust. But people can. People can ask, what else am I accepting as inevitable that was actually just chosen? What other fires are burning underneath the ground that I've been trained not to see? And then, and this is where the sources genuinely fail us, then what? That's the question.